Hi, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Happy to see so many of you here. Some familiar faces, some new faces. It's great. I love a good mix. This is actually our 20th UWC Unlocked Talk, which is hard to believe that we've done 20 or we're about to do 20. So honored to have Tyler Norman here with us today to mark number 20. So thanks, Tyler. All right, so about Tyler. Tyler is an alumni of UWC Mahindra. He's calling into us today from Wisconsin in the USA. His talk will be titled The Mutual Aid Disaster Relief and Community Organizing as Disaster Preparedness. So a bit about Tyler. He's the co-founder and organizer of the aforementioned NGO, Mutual Aid Disaster Relief, which is a grassroots disaster relief network in the US based on principles of solidarity, mutual aid, and autonomous direct action. His experience with disaster response starts in his youth in Wisconsin with a hometown culture of helping your neighbors and mutual aid. He has since helped with disaster responses in multiple wildfires, floods, and tornadoes, including Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and the Chiapas earthquake in 2017. In this session, he's going to talk to us about how we can build community power and fight back against exploitative disaster capitalism, while also reducing the anxiety and isolation that are so prevalent in our postmodern world. So without giving too much more away, I will pass it on to Tyler, and thank you so much again for being with us. Take it away.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone, or evening or middle of the night, wherever you are. I'm very honored for this opportunity and excited to share a story that will surely feel relevant to all. I've been really enjoying these UWC Unlocked Talks. There have been lots of folks from Mahindra College in India, where I graduated in 2003. It was the newest UWC at the time, and it was really experimental still, definitely a very powerful and transformative learning experience. Now, I'm not an intellectual big shot like Valeria or organizing huge international projects like Toby or Andrew. My story is much more humble. But I think it'll still be very interesting to all, especially if you're interested in empowering poor and working class communities and growing grassroots leadership. I'll talk just a little bit about myself and my journey later. The main focus of this talk is a network of local groups that are collectively called Mutual Aid Disaster Relief. It's actually not really an NGO. It's more like a movement, decentralized and organic, really alive. I think of the UWCs as a kind of movement as well, but most UWC graduates choose to place themselves firmly in the world of NGOs, or business or science, academia, policy, etc. But you know what I mean. Implicit in the UWC model is an outlook that assumes that brilliant individuals are going to build these more or less centralized institutions that seek to transform conditions from top down. Today, I look forward to telling you all about an alternative route to making change in our communities. So I have so much to say, but only 30 minutes, so many things can only be mentioned in passing. I'd be happy to talk to any of you all more later. So I'll put my email address on screen now. So, and just for fun, for about 20 minutes, I have this slideshow using illustrations from another group I work with, an educational activism group called Beehive Collective. I really do see myself as a cross-pollinator of ideas and movements, and that's what this webinar is all about too. So we're just gonna get started. All these links that I'm sharing in the slideshow are also gonna be posted in the chat. And if you're in the future watching the recording of this, you won't be able to see the chat, but you can figure it out. You can pause it or whatever. So around 2015, I was invited by friends to join the initial visioning team for a project that we eventually decided to call Mutual Aid Disaster Relief. I like to call it MAD Relief for short. This simple and very literal name was intended to highlight the actions that anyone can do. When it's spelled in lowercase letters, Mutual Aid Disaster Relief is an activity that people do every day all around the world. Helping neighbors who are having a hard time, and especially working collectively to raise up the entire community, this is normal human behavior. And our crews are just a few among hundreds of diverse groups working to encourage this really productive relationship building and community growing approach to make it more integral to everyone's daily lives. Our mission is grassroots, do-it-yourself humanitarian aid, as well as building community power through disaster preparedness, collaborative recovery, and reimagining more sustainable futures grown out of collective generosity and trust. Essentially, we're supporting neighbors helping neighbors in times of crisis. We adapt our tactics to meet unique needs and of different communities experiencing different problems. Most of our organizers and volunteers are coming from poor and working class communities, and they are serving those same communities. We have a slogan that says solidarity, not charity, because our work is all about connecting with others to see that our struggles and problems are interlinked, that we all need a helping hand sometimes, and that we all have something valuable to offer. We strive to use whatever privileges each of us may have to procure resources and pass them along to those who can't easily access them on their own. We recognize that quote unquote natural disasters are different in degree, but not in kind from ongoing crises that impoverished and marginalized peoples experience every day. Therefore, we see DIY disaster response as a revolutionary act, confronting and potentially dismantling systems of oppression, creating new worlds in gaps left when existing structures crumble. I have zillions of stories about how this has played out in past hurricanes, floods, and fires, but in this brief time, we're going to focus on key concepts and then share a few stories about pandemic response. Our website and Facebook page are chock full of great examples though, so check those out. To be clear, we do have a so-called registered nonprofit corporation, which is the technical term for NGO in the USA. But this is just a means for securing more donations and a few other logistical necessities. The vast majority of the work that our network does is decentralized, autonomous direct action from neighbor to neighbor. This is a big difference in several ways. This project is both very humble and very ambitious in ways that are often coming from an opposite approach as a typical NGO. We operate on a shoestring budget. That may be changing because we're getting a lot of positive attention in the last 2 years, but for now, we're all volunteers. All donations that we receive in the central organization are pretty immediately passed on to local groups in frontline communities. And we operate more in the spirit of, you can do this too, rather than, we're here to save the day. We don't have dues-paying members or local chapters. Instead, our approach over the last few years has been to build a network, mostly just connecting with already existing groups that are doing good work in their communities, like free food or free clinics or childcare cooperatives or community gardens, or ecosystem restoration or whatever. This connection making has been a big part of my work as a cross-pollinator, and I'll speak a little bit more about that later. Also, new groups form in crisis moments and they reach out to us for money, materials, or just good advice. We build connections with them over years in an innovative form of movement building that recently has been identified as network organizing. We've been making it up as we go along, but here I have a link to a document that describes that methodology. It's a draft, which is why it's not published on the internet. It's a little rough around the edges, but it's a really good, it's a great document. This other article here includes lots of history about, there's a lot of stuff in there, but there's a lot of history of mutual aid. It's really excellent. Check it out if you still feel unclear about the meaning and implications of this foundational concept. So our website consists mostly of lots of resources that local groups and individuals can utilize to empower themselves and their communities. I encourage all of you to check it out since I won't be able to cover everything in just 30 minutes. On this slide, you can see some of our values and links to more info on the website. We prioritize directing materials and volunteers toward people of color and other marginalized communities because they're so often ignored by the big NGOs. I've seen this really clearly in many situations. Those who have accumulated wealth find it much easier to get help from insurance companies and relief programs, while those who were already struggling are sometimes considered unworthy of aid. For example, a very common example. People who were already homeless before the hurricane hit go to an emergency shelter, and they're required to wear a special bracelet that identifies them essentially as less valuable and less deserving of help. They feel really disrespected and uncomfortable there, and often they just leave and risk it on the streets. We try to do the opposite, encouraging folks to take what they need without asking lots of invasive questions, inviting survivors to transcend their victimized state by volunteering to help others, asking folks what they need, even if they needed it before the disaster, and then reaching out to our networks to try to meet those needs. That is what solidarity, not charity, looks like in practice. So why do we do it this way? In part, it's because it just works better. After the Occupy Wall Street movement changed their name to Occupy Sandy when Hurricane Sandy hit New York City, the US Department of Homeland Security released a report that said that decentralized grassroots aid programs outperformed top-down government and NGO programs in every way, every time. We've posted that study on our website. You can find it at the bottom link. And in part, it's an ideological choice. Our membership is diverse, but tends to appeal to those who have anti-authoritarian beliefs, or in other words, a general distrust and opposition to nation states and corporations. Many of us are anarchists. Surely you all have heard that word before, but it may have a negative connotation. I'd like to clarify that the meaning of that word, it's closely related to, say, monarchy, which means one ruler. Mono equals one, archy equals ruler. So anarchy simply means no ruler. There are many, many different perspectives within this milieu, but the way I see it, the desire for anarchism is just the most idealistic utopian version of the pursuit of democracy. There is a central belief that we all have the ability to live in dignified and joyous ways. We just need to communicate with one another to establish reasonable boundaries and norms, etc., and to collectively defend the most vulnerable from oppressive and dehumanizing violence, or even better, assist them in ways that empower them to defend themselves. People who hold anarchist beliefs are generally opposed to capitalism and colonization, which we see as nearly the exact same thing. If you've ever heard the phrase, private property is theft, that's an anarchist axiom, as well as prisons, as well as opposition to prisons, police, and any type of classism or casteism, plus a general distaste for alienated, mindless consumerism. Contemporary anarchists want to build more community power from below, grow connections and relations to enrich our deeply meaningful lives, and we generally care about the earth and ecosystems as well as traditional people who are protecting their lands and waters. For me, big reasons that I'm drawn to this perspective are celebration of creativity, spontaneity and authenticity, love and relationships and gifts and all things like that. Anarchist perspectives provide abundant opportunities for making one's own meaning, which is very appealing to an artist and radical educator like me. I think that it's just fascinating that anarchist ideas are becoming really hip right now. They even publish articles about anarchism in fashion magazines like Teen Vogue. You see this link here. It's a great article. The reason is clear, because we are once again in a world dominated by corporate colonization. This neoliberal era closely resembles the first half of the 20th century, which was the time of robber barons and totalitarians. It was also the heyday of the original anarchists who fueled the rise of unions, anti-war and anti-fascist movements, feminism and sexual liberation, and etc. Although I'm very grateful for my postmodern education at UWC, I'm not really drawn to the currently trendy post-structuralist ideas. That version of cultural relativism feels kind of hollow and soulless. It's like anti-everything and ultimately divisive. I think that in this era, we can learn more by remembering an older generation. My favorite anarchist thinker was Emma Goldman, a Russian immigrant midwife. She helped women give birth in a traditional way. She founded a magazine called Mother Earth News in 1906. Her working class perspective is humble in a way that's very accessible and radical in a way that's very empowering and encouraging. Back in those days, radical change makers like Emma used the terms anarchist and communist and libertarian interchangeably. They all meant the same thing. Nowadays, all of those words have been corrupted by ideological dogmas, but the ideas that were originally intended are obvious from the roots of the words themselves. These ideas are returning, and younger generations are grappling with the fertile tensions between autonomy and community, responsibility and liberty, and I see some hope there. Well, that's enough of that. Let's get back to Mad Relief. I just want to give that sort of groundwork to understand our perspective. So here in the USA, since Hurricane Katrina in 2005, we have consistently seen appalling government neglect and rapacious opportunism in the wake of climate disasters. It's called disaster capitalism, when corporations take advantage of catastrophes to buy up large swaths of land, force tax cuts and policy changes in their favor, and pursue monopolies squeezing out local businesses, all while the survivors are reeling, just trying to get their lives back in order. This is definitely what's happening in the United States right now under President Trump. All the environmental regulations are getting repealed. The big corporations are getting much, bigger bailouts than local businesses. So there's an excellent book about this called The Shock Doctrine, and the author Naomi Klein has recently been publishing a lot of stuff about quote unquote coronavirus capitalism. If you don't want to read the book, the video linked at bottom is a good 8-minute long summary. And yet, communities do recover together. The incredible positive results that we've seen in the aftermath of recent hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and fires are really a testament to the power of the people. There's this enormous potential that can be released. In our normal daily lives, we're so atomized and separated from our true selves as well as our communities, and it's so painful because that's not the way humans are meant to be. Here in the USA, even in the best of times, there's a dangerous and widespread mental health crisis caused by a society that's become profoundly antisocial. During disasters, people who were barely surviving before are pushed to their breaking point. But crises also open people up so that they're more willing to try new ways of being. New ideas and ways of relating bring new possibilities, becoming catalysts that birth new worlds. There's an excellent book about this idea called A Paradise Built in Hell. Both of these books reference the battle over the soul of post-Katrina New Orleans, as grassroots groups hustled to protect their neighborhoods and profiteers attempted to steal them and turn them into resorts and playgrounds for wealthy tourists. You can get free digital copies of these books at these links. They're really great. I want to talk a little bit more about that phrase, the power of the people. The Black Panther Party here in the USA in the 1970s had a slogan, all power to the people. Black Panther ideas were very important to the formation of the Mad Relief predecessor that was called Common Ground in post-Katrina New Orleans, especially the concept of survival programs. In the squalid 70s, Black Panther survival programs sought to raise consciousness in African Americans and to organize their communities to improve living conditions and to stand up to racist police and city planners. But first they took care of immediate basic needs to empower folks to take the next steps. The most popular survival programs included free breakfast for children, free taxis for elders, free clinics. They even turned an abandoned hospital in New York City into a free drug rehabilitation and free STD or STI testing center. All of these were done with grassroots funding and volunteer labor, and these are only a handful of examples. In just a few short years, the Panthers dramatically transformed the lives of many of the poorest peoples of Oakland, California, as well as Chicago, New York, and all around the country. Tragically, this nationwide Black Power organization was very violently crushed by the FBI, whose director was notoriously racist and could not tolerate people of color standing up for themselves and demanding full human rights. By the way, that's also what happened to other Black and Brown power groups in the 70s, as well as most of the original anarchists too, 100 years ago. In fact, it's a very common story in this very conflicted country. Another common story is that groups which start out revolutionary eventually grow to extend themselves, lose focus on their mission, and then eventually get captured by the corporate NGO system and lose their fire. That's what happened eventually to Common Ground, but the ecosystem restoration that the organization does still now to this day is still very valuable. In fact, it's super important to mitigating future hurricanes. So check out their website if you like. Even though 50 years ago, the world was very different. The stories of the Black Panthers are still inspiring today. I lost my place, excuse me. There was also a sister group called the American Indian Movement, and their struggle placed some of the groundwork necessary for a recent resurgence of native power movements, which exploded in the famous Standing Rock pipeline blockade. Many of our Mad Relief people went to help in North Dakota, knowing how to build field kitchens that feed thousands of people or practice medicine in less than perfectly sanitary conditions, or train young volunteers in nonviolent defensive tactics. These are all very useful skills, not only in the context of disaster recovery, but also in the context of disaster prevention, like stopping a groundwater destroying oil pipeline. So I've been trying to paint this picture of 1, decentralized direct action empowerment of anarchism, 2, pragmatic survival programs of the Black Panthers, and 3, the dignified ecosystem defense of the Standing Rock water protectors. Mad Relief has learned from all of them to create strategies deeply grounded in listening and honoring local cultures and histories, and in prioritizing inclusion and empowerment by affirming individuals' different needs and abilities, while also recognizing that we're all connected in a greater ecosystem, and that simple mutual aid work can be a humble first step on a path toward a better world. So how are we building this movement? Here, I'll tell just a little of my personal story. I come from a working class background in rural Wisconsin in the Great Lakes region of the USA. I got a Davis scholarship, and my UW experience totally changed my life. But I never really left my working class roots. After UWC, I decided that I didn't want to live my life with a ton of debt, so I didn't attend university. At first, I thought it was probably just a gap year, but I enthusiastically jumped into life, and in the end, I never did complete my schooling and get a degree. I was 21 years old when I went to New Orleans to help out with Common Ground. But I'm learning all the time. I love collaboration and learning from others with different experiences. I've been studying concepts of popular education, or pop ed, which sees everyone as teachers and learners together. I've been developing facilitation skills to help diverse groups to discover and learn collaboratively. On this slide, I have some websites that you can check out if you want to see some of my other educational work. Now, 5 years ago, I got a bad illness. Maybe some of you have heard of Lyme disease, and my case was further complicated by taking way too many antibiotics trying to combat the parasites, and I've never really fully recovered. So I've been somewhat sidelined. It kind of feels like I'm stuck in first gear forever, but I'm still happy to contribute to Mad Relief and other movements as much as I can. You know, one of the best things about seeding a movement as opposed to founding an NGO is that it can take on a life of its own. There's no need for me to deplete myself keeping it going. In 2018 and 19, I organized a series of educational training tours in which we visited about 60 different cities across the USA and shared a pop-ed workshop all about community organizing as disaster preparedness. Now, it's a 1.5-day program, so it's impossible to summarize it in just a few sentences. But you can find a facilitation guidebook outlining this workshop on the Mad Relief website so that you can do it with your own community if you want. Spreading these ideas has been really powerful. Now, hundreds of mutual aid groups have sprung up to help each other during the pandemic. And this brings me to another one of my core beliefs, that really lasting change is not made on the policy level, but on the cultural level. It may be incremental and not quantifiable, but it's often more profound because we're making the changes within ourselves and organically, relationally passing them on to others, especially the next generation. I tell this part of the story particularly for any current students who are listening. Listen, I'm never going to convince you to reject university. That's a good path if that's what you want. But I bet that all of you haven't heard often enough that you can also have a very fulfilling life and you can be an agent of change even on a different path. For some of you, it might feel good to hear that once in a while. So I recently moved back to Wisconsin because my tiny hometown got a catastrophic flood in August of 2018. Recovery has been hard, but by now everyone is doing okay. Rural people instinctively know how to show up for each other, and they've no expectation that some NGO will come help them. So they just roll up their sleeves and make it happen. I'm still squarely in the working class. I have a day job, manual labor. I like working with my hands. It's been hard with this illness, but I'm surviving and slowly recovering. I do some really innovative and fun educational work, especially facilitating youth on collaborative, creative projects. You can see that on those websites I referenced earlier. But this year, all that stuff has been canceled. So now I've moved into a little intentional community, and I'm helping to grow a big garden instead. That's that's our version of mutual aid right now. I just keep moving one day at a time and continue searching for good opportunities. I just mentioned this stuff here because I want to say that if any of you would like a pop-ed workshop sometime in the future, please ask me. I'd be happy to visit any of you, even traveling abroad, if we can figure out the logistics of it. My acupuncturist claims that part of what is going wrong with my body is due to a black mold infection that I got 15 years ago in post-Katrina New Orleans. I'm bringing this up in order to emphasize safety. Much of the advice that we give to local groups is about safety and inclusivity. We strive to make this work as accessible to all, regardless of experience or ability. But there are inherently dangerous conditions in disaster situations. So we spend a lot of time talking about how to make this work as safe as possible. We have many such resources on our website. And that brings me around to talking about the pandemic. In so many ways, this situation is the opposite of a typical disaster scenario. In the wake of a flood or fire, everyone comes together and helps each other out, finding camaraderie and meaning in shared hardship and cooperative work. But now we're told that we can't get together, we can't be near each other. This is fundamentally anti-human. And the mental health toll of this pandemic can't be understated. The Mad Relief Network has been convening weekly conference calls as a way of staying connected and sharing information. Many diverse folks have been attending these calls, and I've heard many expressions of gratitude that just holding this space to share good ideas, successes, and failures feels really uplifting. If you're in the USA and you want to join these calls, please contact me and I'll happily connect you. Now, here are a few brief stories about pandemic mutual aid. There are some really inspiring projects coming out of indigenous lands. The Diné, or Navajo people, have a reservation that spans an enormous area across the states of New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. This region is a harsh, high desert, and poverty is endemic. But there's also a persistent traditional culture, and very tight family and community relationships keep people going. Many elders have been resisting a huge coal mine for decades. Now they have the third highest per capita rate of COVID infection in the USA, behind New York and New Jersey. Their situation is particularly difficult because of the lack of running water, but lots of young people have been traveling all over the vast reservation lands, setting up portable hand washing stations and distributing supplies. This beautiful website has lots of resources for Indigenous mutual aid in the pandemic. In New York City, with the world's highest rate of infection, many people are organizing mutual aid programs on a neighborhood level, or even within smaller communities like ethnic or language groups. Folks are doing everything from childcare and educational tutoring, elder care, housing and tenants' rights, including groups advocating for rent strike, PPE distribution, herbal and allopathic medicines, even direct cash grants to folks who lost work and income. There are hundreds of groups working together, meeting needs as much as they can. Check out this website to see some impressive lists of neighborhood and borough-wide groups. And on the mutual aid disaster relief website, you can find a list with tons of examples of other local mutual aid groups. This list is growing daily, and it includes not only pandemic response groups, but also zines and other documents and lots of widely varied resources. It might be a little overwhelming at first, but there's so much, because there's so much in there, but also very inspiring to see how this movement is growing exponentially in a time when it's so needed. Because if you've not been following the news in the USA, the official response has been terribly bungled, and many people can't even get tested to see if they have the virus, much less receive any kind of help. Some of you may already know that healthcare is astronomically expensive here in the US, and many people have no access to go see a doctor. You can also check out these other pages to read or listen to stories about many different mutual aid projects, which some may or may not be associated with Mad Relief. That podcast at the bottom is done by a friend of mine. It's really great. Okay, we'll get to the Q&A session in just 1 minute. But one thing I want to cover briefly is the relation to internationalism. I'm coming back. Hello, everyone. Mad Relief is explicitly a nationally bounded organization. We do not go outside the USA. This is a cautionary adaptation. Some of our people had experience responding to the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. They found themselves to be really confused by an unknown culture. And although they had good intentions, it felt like they were sometimes more of a burden than a help. They brought medical skills, but required constant translation and interpretation. So now we emphasize the benefits of local organizing above all else, though sometimes people still do travel to other regions to help. But I'd be really interested in having a conversation with you all about how these ideas might translate into a more international context. And I'd love to hear examples from your places. If anyone has exciting mutual aid projects that they know about and want to share, or any questions. So that's my story. Thanks for listening. And I'd be happy to answer any questions or hear what you all have to say.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Tyler. And yeah, as Tyler says, we'll go to the Q&A part now. This is, yeah, as he said, both questions and also if you have any stories from your hometown to share. This is a, yeah, open conversation. So as I've put in the chat, if you would like to ask a question, simply indicate it there and I'll start putting together a speaker list. And yeah, who would like to kick us off? I think everyone's been listening so much that we haven't started putting together the list yet. But if anyone would like to speak, you can. Oh, Neela has a question. Let's start with you.
Yes, hi. I don't know. I hope the audio works. I was curious. You said a lot about like the values and that like the bottom-up structure works much more. But I was curious, like, if there's any challenges that you had by not having any like top-down government support, anything where you're like, this is something we actually really need help with.
Yeah, there are certainly challenges and weaknesses to this approach as well, just like anything. The first ones that come to mind for me is that sometimes this type of this approach to this work is slower. We spend a lot more time talking about it rather than someone just giving a directive and sending the employees off to do it. On the other hand, there are also situations where we've been able to move much faster because we don't need to send, the specialist in. Instead we say, hey, we already know somebody in this town. Why don't we contact them and trust them to do what needs to happen in their local place. The other thing is that we don't have very much money. And that sometimes can be a hindrance. It limits our abilities. But there's also something very powerful about the do-it-yourself ethic. And, when local people are working together to take care of one another, instead of waiting for someone, who's a disaster relief specialist to show up and show them the way, it's really powerful and empowering to those folks. So even though it's very true that there are some weaknesses, it has just been a really incredible experience for me to see over the last, decade and a half. I've seen so many examples of the government agencies and the Red Cross and other big NGOs like that being super inefficient and spending millions, perhaps even billions of dollars on things that never really make it to the people who need it the most. And we're able, I don't have that many examples from the pandemic because I've got my own health problems, and I'm a little less active nowadays. But my memories from Common Ground in New Orleans was that, with like 1% of the, less than 1% of the budget of the Red Cross, we were helping more people in more profound ways. It was like there was no comparison. It was actually, it was shameful what the Red Cross was doing. I'm not going to dwell on that, but you know, if we can, you know, if you're interested, I'd be happy to tell you lots of stories about that. They actually got sued. There was a class action lawsuit because they raised $1 billion after Hurricane Katrina, and nothing really, like very, very little made it down to the people who needed it the most. Whereas we were mobilizing thousands of volunteers to help people in these really practical ways, cleaning up their homes enough so that they could start rebuilding and move back home and all that sort of stuff. Is very powerful. We saved, I mean, we literally saved whole neighborhoods by restoring schools that would have been otherwise bulldozed and things like that.
Okay.
Like another follow-up question to what you just said, because you said that like you were more successful in some ways, like much more than like NGOs or government agencies. Like, how did you measure success? Because I think that's a very interesting thing to think about in disaster responses. Like, are you successful once everyone is fine again, or like how are you saying, like, how's your measurement as an organization?
Yeah. Well, because it's so short time, it's going to be challenging for me to really explain it well. But in New Orleans, about 1 year after the hurricane, the population of the city was half of what it had been before. Half of the people who evacuated were not able to come back into their homes. And many of those people were not able to get any help. And so the main work that we were doing with Common Ground was cleaning out mold and other sort of toxic stuff out of people's homes, just enough so that they could get moved into their homes and start fixing up themselves, you know, little by little, but do it in a way that, you know, was safe. There's not mold and all these other hazards. So that's mostly, from our perspective, that's what we were mostly measuring, you know, whereas the Red Cross was measuring things like numbers of meals handed out. But let me tell you, I saw those meals. They were going around with food trucks and they were handing people, random people on the street, they were handing them styrofoam containers that had one cold hot dog and a can of pineapple in it, you know, and that was a meal, you know, and like, sure, they handed out thousands of those things, but it didn't make, you know, that didn't make people feel good. It didn't make them feel like they cared about them. It made them feel like they actually were being treated like trash. Whereas we dealt with people in a way that was really, you know, sort of honored their humanity a lot more. Those things are not quantifiable. And, you know, that's definitely something that some of this work is not, it's not possible to, you know, to compare it, you know, in numbers and stuff like that. But people feel it, like they feel the difference in really profound ways.
Okay. Next, we've got a question from Aspen, and she's asked me to read it out. So it's, what has been your experience collaborating with local governments?
Yes, that's interesting. My personal experience collaborating with local governments is not extensive. But there's some of that in New Orleans. We worked with a lot of different local groups, NGOs, informal networks, also local governments, city council, things of that nature. And this group Common Ground got a lot of positive reviews, even from city council and stuff like that. Simply because we were doing the work effectively. We were helping people and the results were visible. And, you know, New Orleans saw very little help. There was the national government, like, didn't really send them anything, very, very, very little. Nowadays, with the pandemic, there's actually a lot of contention with local governments. I've been hearing a lot of stories about folks, you know, the police try to shut them down when they're handing out free food and stuff like that. you know, because it's not safe or whatever. But, you know, what we've been doing, especially with these weekly phone calls, is sharing a lot of ideas that help us to, that a lot of ideas of what is an effective way to share food and share medicine, where we're not transmitting the virus. And there's a lot of creative sort of ideas around that. But a lot of times, especially with the groups that are explicitly have this sort of like revolutionary attitude, local governments don't really like that, as you can imagine. So there is a little bit of a contentious sort of thing. And I actually think that there's a lot of interesting opportunities in that tension. You know, we're bringing ideas that are really outside of the box for many people, and yet at the same time, they're ideas that are really ancient, right? Like people just showing up and helping each other in times of need. That's what humans have been doing as long as we've been humans. That's what people do every day. So in many ways, what we're doing, it's not very, here in the United States, it often feels innovative because all of us are so separated. Our communities are so fractured. We spend so much time, you know, building with just a few people who have the same idea as us, and we kind of ignore our neighbors, and that culture is really problematic. So, you know, what we're bringing is in many ways, you know, it feels innovative and it feels revolutionary, but it's really actually just super simple, sort of basic human stuff. I'm not sure if that was a very good answer, but I hope it was good enough.
Thanks, Tyler. Next, we have a question from Elisabeth.
Yeah.
Would you like to unmute yourself? There you are.
Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing your story. My question is connected to this idea of sort of super bottom up, and you keep saying how you've been helping out a lot entire communities. So I wonder what the sizes of these communities are and how in practice you work out the logistics of decision making, because I can imagine that like in the chaos of disasters and with large numbers of people, there needs to be some sort of, in a way, more top down organizing for things to work out. So how do you get around that part?
Yeah, totally. So that's a great question. And there's not a simple answer to it. That's something that we are figuring out as we go. A lot of what we do, sometimes it's hard to explain in a simple soundbite, because a lot of the organizing that we do is sort of ad hoc, like in the sense that when something comes up, we get together and we say, how are we going to deal with this? And we form a new committee. You know, every single unique instance we approach in a unique way. And we tend to encourage small, super local groups, literally neighbors helping neighbors. And so oftentimes, you know, one volunteer group in one city will consist of 10 or 20 people that are, you know, that are really working hard at this stuff. And then they have hundreds of neighbors who might participate in little ways here and there, but the central organizing group is a small group, and it's a deliberative process. And like I said before, sometimes it takes a really long time, and there's a lot of challenges. And this can be seen as a weakness, I'll admit it. You know, it's like there are some problems that come with this, but it's also a really awesome opportunity for folks to practice working together, to practice sharing their ideas and collaborating and building something together. And that process in itself is incredibly empowering. And I actually think that process of making decisions together is one of the most important elements of what we do. And even though it does have some, it makes things sometimes take longer, it makes things sometimes a little more chaotic, What we've mostly seen is that it's worth it in the end, because many people that I know have been sort of turned on by this do-it-yourself, humanitarian aid. Is like, it opens up their eyes, and they say both, now I see, why colonization and racism and classism are such a problem. I see it in a really tangible way. And then they also say, and I feel like I can do something about it. And so many people who I met in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina have now devoted their lives to uplifting their communities, whether that be like a racial or cultural community, or their city or their neighborhood or whatever. It's been really inspiring to see that people can in fact do this stuff. You can do it too. And I can't say that enough. It's like, so often, especially here in the US, we receive these messages from mainstream culture that make us really feel really small and really powerless, and that we need experts to tell us how we should feel and what we should do. And sometimes those experts are really helpful. I'm not going to be too dogmatic about it, but that experience of figuring it out yourself, figuring it out together, can be really transformative. I'll say one more thing about this, which is that you might have different opinions. You might not agree with my political stance. You might think that anarchism is a totally terrible idea, and that's fine. But in situations where systems break down, where the normal way of doing things is no longer possible in a sudden catastrophic way, you probably want the anarchists on your side. Because those of us who are in this sort of milieu, we learn a lot of skills together. We know how to build things. We know how to fix things. We know how to do ecosystem restoration. We know how to work together. We know how to facilitate group meetings. All this sort of stuff becomes really, really important when the normal way of doing things suddenly one day doesn't work anymore.
Thank you. Now we've got a question from Martin. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi. Thanks, Tyler. Great work and great talk. And I two questions, if I may. One is kind of following on what was just being talked about. So I know the ideal of Mad Relief is really to help people to help each other, right? And so it's ultimately about using internal resources. But I'm wondering how you kind of strike that balance when you as an organization, when you reach out to people in a community, well, how you strike that balance between, reaching out to and activating resources that people already have, and bringing resources in from the outside, because that's kind of the stand-in paradigm of disaster relief, right? Is you bring in resources from the outside. And if people were able to do everything for themselves already, then you wouldn't be needed, and then nothing else would be needed, right? People would already have it there. So, So my question is sort of, what is that balance in practice, and how do you make sure that in coming in to activate people to help each other, you don't end up kind of displacing local, initiative, and kind of, bring in people to do stuff for them? So that's my one question. And my other question is, and you can tell me later if you're interested, I'm actually co-organizing a big social science survey that we're going to be rolling out across Canada and the US to ask people how they're helping their neighbors and community members out during COVID, sort of mutual aid survey. So if you have any ideas for things that you would ask in that kind of survey, I would love to hear them.
Okay. Maybe something will come to me about that second question, and maybe not. Maybe we can talk about it more later. But I'll answer the first question. That's a really, really important point, it's something that is, it may be the biggest challenge that we face, especially when there's a group of like mostly white people who have this sort of weird ideological stance called anarchism that's like really foreign to certain communities. Like, you know, we're these sort of aliens, you know, and we're and we have to be really careful to not, in our excitement and our desire to help, to not roll over people and actually disempower them. But, you know, by saying, hey, we're here to help, like we're gonna save the day, right? It's really tempting to be a savior, but it's actually ultimately fairly destructive to be a savior, at least from our perspective. So this is something we talk about all the time. And a big part of that 1.5-day long workshop that I mentioned is looking at this sort of stuff. How do you do things in a way that's empowering and uplifting rather than sort of patronizing? Let me give so a really good example is after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, there were a lot of local groups that formed. They were called Centros de Apoyo Mutuo, mutual aid centers. And they were very local and they were very rooted in their communities, but they also didn't necessarily have much funds. So we here in the mainland United States, we raised lots of money. We located some folks who made things like solar panels and stuff like that available at cost. And then we got some donations to pay for those things. And we sent to these Centros de Apoyo Mutuo, we sent, so far we've sent a couple of off-grid solar power, like a whole system. There's also these water filtration devices. And one of the coolest centros is in a place called Caguas, and they assessed what their community needed, and they found that they needed a community center, and that people needed laundry more than anything else because all their clothes were getting moldy. And so like laundry, just such a simple, like unsexy thing as like laundry machines, was actually the most important thing to getting people back on their feet. So now they have this free laundry that's solar powered. It's in an elementary school that was closed because it got defunded, and they use it as a community center. They serve free food out of there. They have weekly clinics where people can can see a doctor and get some diagnosis and maybe a little bit of herbal medicine, and they're doing educational programs and all this sort of stuff. A few of our people went there to help them, but mostly those were people who had family in Puerto Rico or had really important special skills like medical skills. And we didn't send anyone who wasn't in either of those two categories because we felt like if you're just doing this to have an adventure, no judgment, that's okay, but that's not what those people need. You know, that's not what they need. Maybe we can find ways to like improve our own communities, and in this paradigm of solidarity, all of us improving our local communities will hopefully in the long run, the rising tide will lift all boats. Let's talk later, one-on-one about this survey, because I also noticed we're out of time. I talked a little too long and I'm sorry about that, but time goes by fast.
Hey, yeah, we are, as this always happens, we're zoomed to the end and there's just always so many great things to talk about. But if people are happy to stay on a little bit longer, we'll take final 2 questions if you are as well, Tyler. Okay, so first up we've got Vivek. You'd like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello.
Hi, Tyler. I was wondering, sorry, I'm not gonna put on my video to show you my horrible COVID haircut. But I was wondering if you could speak to the role of art and culture, and specifically its preservation when you engage in projects like this, and how you're able to do that kind of work because of the way that you do things. Thanks. Yes,
that's a big question. It's really important to me. you know, I think I mentioned that one of the things I ended up doing with Common Ground in New Orleans was eventually working with middle school and high school students in these after school programs, and a lot of educational stuff, a lot of sort of creative projects as well. And I think that the cultural aspect of this work must be integral to the whole project. I think that if we take an approach that sees people's basic needs as solely material, you know, like you need food and a roof and some money, and like as long as you have those things, you're going to be fine, we're really missing something important. Folks need human connection. Folks need meaning in their lives, maybe more than anything else, you know? And one of the things that's really interesting, and I don't know how it's going to play out, but it's fascinating, is that within this whole mutual aid disaster relief movement, we're developing this very particular culture where, you know, people feel within this movement, feel this powerful sense of camaraderie. They feel these profound, really rich connections with one another. The shared experience, shared ideas make us feel like we're fully human, right? And if we don't have these things, you know, the isolation that people are experiencing right now because of coronavirus is, I mean, it's really, really dangerous. I don't even know how to describe it. It's like, I'm living in this, you know, communal house right now. So I've got lots of people around me. We're doing projects together, and that feels really good. If I was stuck in an apartment all by myself, I don't know what I would do. Well, probably I would make art and stuff, because that would at least give me maybe not another person to communicate with, but like a project or an object to communicate with. I feel really strongly that being an agent of change, there's so many different paths to do that. But doing it in a way that is simple, personal, changing our culture in incremental ways, you know, it's not quantifiable, just like we were talking about earlier. You know, you can't, you know, put the results on a graph, but you can feel the change in your heart, you know, and you can develop new relationships with people that can completely change the world, even that means just, you know, change your perspective. That's also a way of changing the world, you know. And working with the Beehive Collective, which I didn't even talk about, but I would, if any of you all want to talk about that, you can contact me later. That has been a really amazing experience for me. That work is all about, how to say it? It's just all about traveling to different communities, sharing ideas, having conversations, using the art as a way to present new ideas so that it's accessible and digestible and easy to understand and welcoming and collaborative and conversational. And, you know, I think it's been really powerful. That aspect of art and education is integrated into our work with mutual aid disaster relief as well.
Thanks, Tyler. I've always appreciated the kind of the way in which you insist on thinking about art and culture and that preservation too in the face of disaster. So thanks for sharing that.
Okay, final question or comment, I think, is from Chris.
Hey, Tyler. We talked a little bit about a year ago trying to organize a stop in Baltimore, but didn't work out.
Oh yeah, you're in Baltimore. Great.
Yeah, but in any event, I just wanted to talk about doing like actual mutual aid work, like during all this stuff, the practical end of it. I've been mostly doing sort of like food sovereignty stuff, particularly Food Not Bombs, and other kind of like food waste projects. And, I don't want to get derailed on that, but basically the thing that I want to talk about is we've had this problem where, you know, this idea of like solidarity, not charity, being so paramount, and really struggling on how to kind of keep moving food and doing all this stuff while being safe, and it feeling like a lot of the opportunities for solidarity, being a mutual aid project, is really kind of being mitigated. So, for example, you know, doing Food Not Bombs, you know, what we've kind of agreed to is like having no more than 5 people in the space at a time. You know, only kind of regulars. That limits, you know, the community aspect of it, of people kind of joining in and spreading, you know, making food for themselves and, you know, their friends or whoever else, you know what I mean? Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine that there's a lot of different projects out there that are going through the same problem of doing like physical kind of like, you know, hand-to-hand kind of work, and not really knowing how to scale it to the crisis, and being a mutual aid project that can grow and encompass a community and more people, rather than basically just a charity where we're just kind of serving food and kind of leaving. So I don't really know, you know, there's a question there somewhere, I guess, but it's something that I keep coming back to. You know, I'm working on it probably like 4 or 5 days a week right now, and
Oh, okay.
I just don't know how to get around it.
Yeah. I mean, yes, you're absolutely right. I unfortunately don't have an easy answer for you, because it's a huge challenge. I mean, I mentioned it just briefly before, but like, this pandemic thing is in many ways the exact opposite of a natural disaster. When there's a flood or a fire or an earthquake, people instantly come together and start helping each other out in this very physically intimate, like near, you know, this closeness is a big element of it. And now we're told that we can't do that. So it's like our normal approach to things has been turned totally on its head. And, you know, in terms of examples of what others are doing to try to solve these problems, I would direct you towards the links. I shared a couple of links. One is, it was the last slide, actually. One of them was what was it called? Collective Care. There's a page on our website called Collective Care, and there's just tons of links to other groups. So you can see what other groups are doing and where they're having successes. And then that podcast that's called Mutual Aid on Lockdown, that's made by a friend of mine, and they've got about 10 episodes so far, and they're just basically, they're asking that question, like, how do we do this stuff in this pandemic situation? Like, how do we need to adapt our approach and our tactics to match the actual needs that are there, which are, for many of us, it's like totally outside of our experience, right? We're like, you know, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I don't know the answer to your question, you know? And that's all the more reason for us to figure it out together.
Thanks, Tyler.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler. I put the links you just mentioned in the chat again, so you can see them there. So yeah, this brings us to the end. Thank you so much. There's so many amazing ideas to now keep mulling over, I think. And yeah, you'll see the other links that Tyler posted at the beginning of the chat if you scroll up while we're still here. Otherwise, yeah, if you would like them after the chat, I'm sure that we can also pass them on. And Tyler very generously also offered his email if you have further questions, which I'll again post in the chat. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thanks to Celia and Sarah, and thanks to all my Yuki friends and my old school, high school friends who have attended this. it's really nice to reconnect with you all. And let's stay in touch.
If you'd like to unmute yourselves and say hi and bye to Tyler, feel free. It's always nice to hear everyone's voice as we leave. And thank you again so much, Tyler, and everyone for being here.
Thanks, Tyler.
Bye, Tyler.
Thanks, Tyler.
Bye.
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 Thank you.
Thanks, Tyler.
Thank you, Tyler.